You were always second best. I can almost hear that sentence in my own voice as I write it, like I'm speaking to a mirror that refuses to reflect the man I used to be. I'm not sure if I'm writing this for you or for me. Maybe I'm just spilling everything onto the page, hoping that the raw truth might set me free. Some things need to be put into words, even if the words themselves choke me. So I'm writing this as if it were a letter I'll never send, a confession I'll never speak aloud. But deep down, I know I'm speaking to you, and to her, and to him. Perhaps to the man I was before it all collapsed. There's a chill at the base of my neck. It's the same cold sensation I had on the day everything changed. I remember sitting at the head of our dining table, though head is a cruel joke now. My wife, Rebecca, was sitting to my left, her mother to my right. My father-in-law has been gone for years. Her mother is now the family's matriarch by default. She was sipping her iced water with that perfectly disapproving expression. The slight pinch of her lips, the elevated eyebrows, the way she holds the glass so delicately, as if the rest of us are filthy children in her pristine parlor. Sometimes I feel she sees me not just as a man who doesn't match her daughter's worth, but as a stain on the tablecloth of her life. That day, I hated how calm she looked, and how easily she decided to destroy me in front of everyone. Before we get to that, I should mention the context. It was our anniversary celebration, a quiet one. Ironically, we'd planned a small gathering. My wife wanted only family, though that word has become a labyrinth for me. It was supposed to be a pleasant evening, a short toast, some laughter, maybe even a kiss on the cheek from my mother-in-law if the planets aligned. Instead, we ended up with a confrontation that made my heart pound so loudly I could hear my own blood in my ears. We were all seated around the table, dinner half finished. I should have seen the tension in Rebecca's eyes, or the forced smile on her mother's lips, but I was too focused on the safe mechanical gestures. Pass the salt, top up your glass. When her mother finally stood up, it was like she was commanding a jury. She pointed her finger at me and said, "Where is my watch? The one that cost $15,000. For a moment, I didn't understand. I just blinked at her, my mouth slack. Then I realized she was accusing me of stealing it. She said I'd taken her prized watch, that I'd gone behind her back, stolen it from her bedroom, and now I was hiding it. As she spoke, I swear I could see the little triumph in her eyes, like she'd been rehearsing that line, waiting to deliver her final blow. The entire room froze. Even our son, sitting with a piece of bread in his small hands, went quiet. Rebecca looked away, as if she wasn't sure whose side to take. Or maybe she knew exactly whose side she was on, and it wasn't mine. The weight of the accusation slammed into me, compressing my lungs so much I could barely breathe. A $15,000 watch, stolen. I'd never so much as borrowed a fork without permission in that house. Yet here she was, calling me a thief in front of my own child. My face burned. Rage and humiliation surged in me like a fire that threatened to burst from my chest. My voice trembled as I tried to protest. "I don't know what you're talking about. I would never." But she cut me off with a snort of disdain. That's when I heard my son's voice. It was so calm, almost curious, that it felt even more cruel because children shouldn't be that matter-of-fact about adult betrayals. He asked, "Dad, is that uncle who visits Mom going to come to my morning performance?" He was innocent, obviously. The words were just a child's question. But to me, it was a hammer blow to the gut. The world spun around me. I felt I might throw up, or pass out, or die. He had just given name to the presence I'd been suspecting but dreading. He didn't know what he was saying, but I did. And I looked at Rebecca, my wife, realizing that, yes, she'd been having a man over while I was at work. My own son had been greeting him, calling him uncle. I couldn't speak. My lips moved, but no sound came out. My mother-in-law let out a sanctimonious little sigh, like she was bored with the subject now that she'd shattered my dignity. The accusations, the stolen watch, the humiliating question from my son. It all crushed me in that moment. I stared at Rebecca, seeking the smallest sign of empathy, or denial, or some spark of love that might prove me wrong. Instead, she just looked down. There was no pity, no consolation in her gaze. The entire room closed in around me, and I felt caged like an animal. My hand reached out and grabbed the edge of the table, nearly toppling a glass. Nobody said anything. The silence was thick, poisonous. I wanted to stand and shout, to demand an explanation, to defend myself. But my voice wouldn't come. In that quiet, I felt something sharp open inside my chest, like a chasm that had been waiting to split. Maybe that was when I first understood I was no longer the man I thought I was. That night, after everyone left, I sat alone in my bedroom, the lights off, listening to my wife move around in the living room. It felt like a stranger was walking in my house. You might wonder why I didn't confront her then and there, why I didn't chase down the mother-in-law or call the police to defend my name. But the truth is, in that moment, all my fight deserted me. I felt a quiet, suffocating defeat. The next morning, as I was leaving for work, I stopped by the living room, hoping to talk to Rebecca about our son's question. She just shook her head. "Let's not do this now," she said softly, as if we were discussing groceries. I took a breath, tried to muster some courage, but I saw that hint of steel in her eyes. She wasn't going to explain. She wasn't going to argue. She was shutting me out. That day at the office, I just stared blankly at spreadsheets, not even registering the numbers. My job is all about finances and analysis. But for once, I couldn't keep my thoughts straight. All I saw was that moment. My mother-in-law pointing her finger, my son's innocent question, and Rebecca's silent acceptance of it all. I found the note the next evening after dinner. I came home earlier than usual, hoping to catch her in a talkative mood, to ask her directly who that man was. Rebecca wasn't there, but a folded piece of paper rested on the kitchen table. At first, I thought it was a bill. Then I saw my wife's handwriting. It was brief, almost clinical. A few lines that said, "I'm not sure when we lost it, but we did. I've tried to keep this secret, not to hurt you. I'm sorry. Please don't make a scene in front of our son." And that was it. The words wrapped me in a sickening numbness. There was no name, no details, but the meaning was obvious. She was admitting to an affair, or at least to someone else. The direct confession turned my stomach. I read it again and again, hoping my eyes would reveal some hidden message that might say, "Actually, this is all a misunderstanding." But the words were real. I think I spent half that night just walking around the house. Each room felt like a chapter of our marriage, once cozy, now turned cold. I touched the couch we bought together, remembering how we'd tested so many before choosing the perfect one. I stood in the kitchen, where we once slow danced late at night, giggling like teenagers. I looked at the photo frames on the wall, capturing a happy couple on vacations, birthdays, and Christmases, our smiles broad and full of promises. Now, everything felt staged, a facade behind which my wife hid her real heart. And perhaps I was just too busy, or too naive, to see it until our son's words tore down the curtain. I forced myself to call her the next day. My voice trembled as I asked, "Rebecca, is there something we should talk about?" She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "We will, but not now." That was the entire conversation, like she was giving me an appointment for heartbreak. My anger flared, but it felt hollow. I wanted to demand answers, but something in her tone shut me up. I hung up. The emptiness weighed on me. I tried to remind myself that I was a man, that I had the right to know who was walking into my home, who was near my child. But it was like my self-respect was held hostage by the possibility of losing everything else. My marriage, my illusions, maybe even my role as a father. A week crawled by. I didn't see the man, but I felt his presence in the rearranged flowers on the table, the new candle scents in the living room, the occasional smirk on Rebecca's face when she checked her phone. My mother-in-law had apparently left the city for a while, so there was no scolding from her side. Our son was innocent in the crossfire, and I tried to be normal around him, to shield him from the mounting tension. But inside, I was dying. Then came the night I discovered the truth in the worst possible way. I got home later than usual because of a meeting that ran over. I parked my car in the driveway and noticed another car. A black sedan, sleek with out-of-state plates. A part of me wanted to stay in the car, lock the doors, and pretend I didn't see it. But my legs moved on their own, carrying me to the front door like an automaton. When I entered, the house lights were dim, a soft glow from the living room. Then I heard something, an unmistakable hush of voices, followed by a low moan. My muscles tensed, and I stood there in the hallway, trying to decide whether to fling open the living room door or turn around and flee. I took a step forward, then another. My heart hammered against my rib cage so violently that I thought it might crack a bone. My breathing came in short, sharp stabs. I reached the edge of the doorway and froze. Rebecca was there, on the couch, half-dressed, her blouse undone, her hair loose across her shoulders. And beneath her, or rather around her, was a man I'd never seen in person, but recognized from the glimpses I'd caught around the neighborhood. Tall, broad-shouldered, the look of someone who spent half his life in a gym. He had one hand on her waist, the other in her hair. They were locked in an intimate position, and her face was flushed with something that looked suspiciously like happiness or lust. My hand shook so badly that I grabbed the doorframe to steady myself. He moved first, startled by my presence. He jerked away, nearly dropping Rebecca. She let out a small gasp. For a split second, we all just stared at each other in that half-lit room. Me, the outraged husband. Him, the intruder with hunger still in his eyes. Her, the woman who once called me her safe harbor, now undone in a stranger's arms. No one spoke. Finally, he rose, hastily buttoning his shirt. Rebecca grabbed a throw blanket, clutched it to her chest, not in modesty, but more like protecting herself from my gaze. I wanted to yell, to roar, but I couldn't. My throat closed up. All that came out was a guttural noise. I glared at him. He looked back, measuring me in an almost clinical way, as though deciding whether I was a threat. My wife whispered, "Michael, please, let's just..." But she couldn't finish. Then he grabbed his jacket, tossed an apologetic glance at Rebecca, and brushed past me without a word. I was shaking. I heard the front door open and shut. Silence descended again. Rebecca and I stood in the living room, a lamp casting shadows on the walls. The couch was disheveled. My wife's hair was still messy from his hands. I couldn't move. She pulled the blanket tighter around her, tears glistening in her eyes. But she didn't say sorry. She didn't run to me, didn't beg for forgiveness. She just looked at me, as if waiting for me to make the first move. My voice finally emerged, ragged. "How long?" She swallowed. "A while," she said quietly, not even denying it. I tried to speak again, but I felt my lip tremble. Something inside me just collapsed. I turned and headed for the door. She called my name, but I didn't turn around. I left. I drove endlessly for an hour, almost on autopilot. I ended up in front of a convenience store, staring at the neon lights, wishing I could rewind time. A few days later, I demanded a face-to-face talk. Or demanded is too strong a word. Maybe I just asked. We sat across from each other in the kitchen, her wearing a simple shirt and jeans, me still in my work clothes. Our son was asleep upstairs. I started to speak about how we might fix this, about couples therapy, or maybe we needed time apart, or maybe she should just tell me why. She answered in a monotone. She said, "Michael, I'm not sure I can explain it to you." I asked, "Do you love him?" She shrugged. "I don't know. I care about him. He's exciting. He's different from what we have." She said those words with a quiet acceptance that left me feeling like a fool. I steeled myself. "We have a child," I said, tears threatening to spill. She nodded, her eyes distant. Then I demanded at least that she clarify to our son that this man is not some friendly uncle, She sighed, said she'd handle it. And that was it. I realized then that Rebecca had already made her choice. She was telling me that I'd lost her without saying it directly. She didn't say she was leaving. She didn't say she was staying. She just existed in that cold halfway point. I wanted her to shout or cry or show some passion, but all I got was emptiness. Meanwhile, my mother-in-law's accusations were still hanging over me like a guillotine. She'd repeated them to other relatives, apparently stirring up a rumor that I was some desperate gambler who took her watch to pay off debts. I confronted her on the phone, telling her I'd never touched her property, but she just laughed. "You can't prove anything, can you?" she said, almost giddy. And then she added something that made my blood boil. "You never were good enough for my daughter. Now she's found a real man. But I won't let a thief stay in this family." She hung up, leaving me white-knuckled, pressing the receiver to my ear as if it were a lifeline. My next move was probably a mistake, but I had to know. I tracked down the watch. I called pawn shops, jewelers, everyone I could find in the area, describing the model and serial number. I even reached out to a friend who used to be a private investigator. Days of searching. Finally, I discovered that the watch was sold by a man matching a certain description. Tall, broad shoulders, gave a name that sounded fake. It didn't take me long to realize it had to be Rebecca's lover, the same man I'd caught in my house. He'd sold the watch for quick cash. And now, of course, her mother blamed me. I confronted Rebecca about it, expecting her to defend me, to come forward to her mother and say, it was Josh, or it wasn't Michael. But she just stared at me with tired eyes and said, "I don't want to get involved." That's when something in me snapped. Not get involved. He's your lover. It's your mother's watch. She's destroying my reputation, calling me a thief. And my wife just gave me that same exhausted look, as if I were a tedious puzzle she had no patience to solve. That night, I dreamed I was drowning in cold water, reaching for the surface but never breaking through. I woke up with tears on my cheeks. I realized I was losing more than just my wife's affections. I was losing who I was. The man who prized honesty, loyalty, kindness. He felt like a battered shell. Days turned into weeks. The tension only grew. My son, oblivious to the adult war, kept asking about that uncle who sometimes gave him candy. I wanted to punch a wall every time I heard that word. My mother-in-law pressed her accusations, making it clear she'd do anything to push me out of their lives. Rebecca grew even more distant, though I sensed regret flickering in her eyes once or twice. The so-called lover, Josh was his name, had the audacity to show up at our place a few times, waiting in the car while my wife calmly stepped out and talked to him on the driveway, as if I weren't even there. At one point, I considered simply leaving, letting them have their perfect little arrangement. But our son was the anchor keeping me in that house. I couldn't abandon him. And I couldn't walk away from the cruelty of these lies that branded me a thief. That's when I decided. I needed proof. I needed to show my mother-in-law, to show everyone that it was Josh who stole and sold her watch. I reached out again to my friend, the former PI. We gathered the evidence, the date and time the watch was pawned, a copy of the transaction, and the partial ID used, clearly fake, but with enough detail to match Josh's description. The pawnshop owner remembered him, said he was charming, but in a hurry. We compiled it all into a neat folder. I thought about presenting it calmly, rationally, but something in me yearned for a final confrontation, a moment to reclaim my dignity and put an end to the slander. So I arranged a little gathering, much like the disastrous anniversary dinner. It was short notice, but I told them we needed a family meeting to discuss urgent matters. My mother-in-law arrived with her usual look of disapproval, her shoulders stiff. My wife came out of the kitchen, pale but silent. Our son was upstairs, playing. Josh showed up because, apparently, he was now part of this warped family dynamic. He stood off to the side, arms crossed, looking bored. I stood there, in the living room, a folder clutched in my hands. My mouth was dry, but my anger fueled me. "I have something to say," I began. No one moved. I turned to my mother-in-law. "You've been accusing me of stealing your wash." "I didn't. I can prove who really did." She sniffed in disdain but said nothing. I opened the folder, one page at a time, describing the timeline. Describing how the watch was sold on such and such a date, how the pawn ticket matched a name suspiciously similar to a known alias of Josh. The more I laid out the details, the whiter her face became. Josh tried to interrupt once or twice, but my glare shut him up. My wife stood there, arms wrapped around herself, looking at the floor. It was viciously satisfying, in a way, to see the old woman's face twist in confusion and fear. "But why would he?" she started to ask, her voice trembling. I pointed at Josh. "You want the truth. He took your watch, sold it, then let you blame me. And you," I pointed at Rebecca, "did nothing to clear my name." My voice caught in my throat. For a moment, I thought I might break down. But I held on. "All this time, you let me be the scapegoat. For what? So you two could carry on in secret." Josh scoffed. "This is ridiculous," he said, but his eyes betrayed him. I looked at Rebecca, waiting, yearning for her to speak, to defend me, to redeem me in some small way. But she remained silent, tears glimmering at the corners of her eyes. My mother-in-law turned to Josh, fury igniting in her features. "Is this true?" she hissed. He raised his hands, stammered out something about needing money for a quick investment. The older woman's face contorted with rage and betrayal. "You liar," she spat. "You used my daughter, you used me." That's when I realized it wasn't enough for me. I wanted them to see the full extent of their cruelty, their betrayal. "I was faithful," I said, my voice trembling. "I was loyal to this family. I never wanted to be at war with you. But you called me a thief. You said I was never good enough." I looked at my wife, feeling the sting of tears. "Rebecca, you let me stand alone, humiliated in front of our son. And you never spoke a word to defend me." She finally broke her silence, her voice faint. "I'm sorry." It was barely audible. She stepped forward, as if to touch my arm, but I recoiled. My heart pounded with so many mixed emotions: anger, sadness, love, and the heartbreak of seeing the woman I adored turned into a stranger. Maybe I wanted her to beg for forgiveness. Maybe I wanted her to pull me close and say she'd made a terrible mistake. But all she could do was whisper, "I'm so sorry," again and again, tears streaking her cheeks. I felt a wave of pity and love for her, warring with my own battered pride. My mother-in-law was berating Josh now, her voice shrill with betrayal. He tried to talk back, but she wouldn't let him finish. The confrontation turned chaotic, a swirl of accusations, regrets, raised voices. In the center of it, I stood silently, letting them tear at each other. For once, I was no longer the victim. I was the witness to their downfall. And I realized with startling clarity that I wanted no part in this madness anymore. Eventually, my mother-in-law stormed out, practically pushing Josh aside. He followed her, cursing under his breath. The front door slammed. Rebecca and I were left alone in the living room. The house felt eerily still, apart from our ragged breathing. She looked at me with desperation, tears still on her face. "Michael, let's talk," she pleaded. I just shook my head. "We tried talking. You chose silence. You chose him. You let me become a villain in my own home. I was second place to everything. Your mother, your lover, your own convenience." My voice cracked at the end. I remembered the note she'd left me, the confession. The nights I tried to reason with her, the image of her half-dressed with him on our couch. I took a trembling breath. There's nothing left to say. She stepped closer, but I turned away and left the room. My son was upstairs, probably blissfully unaware, playing with his toys or reading a book. I went to him, tried to speak, but my throat tightened. He looked up at me, puzzled. "Dad, are you okay?" I knelt by him, brushed a hand over his hair. "I'm fine." I lied, my voice hoarse. Just got something in my throat. I made him dinner that night. Rebecca stayed in our bedroom, or maybe she left the house for a bit. I didn't care. My entire chest felt hollow. When my phone buzzed hours later, I saw it was her number. She must have slipped out to clear her head. I stared at the screen, the device vibrating in my hand, the nerve endings in my heart refusing to respond. Then, almost gently, I pressed the button and declined the call. Turned the phone off. In that moment, I felt a grim kind of relief. I disconnected from her voice, from the story that had become my hell. I slept on the couch, ironically the same place I'd caught her in his arms. As I lay there, the house silent around me, I thought of how many times I tried to salvage our marriage, or at least salvage the trust we once had. Now, it seemed impossible. She'd broken it. Her mother had hammered the shards deeper, and her lover had taken what was left. I lay awake, staring at the dark ceiling, feeling my heart pound with both sorrow and a strange sense of finality. Over the next few days, I went through the motions. Took our son to school, worked my job, came home, avoided conversation. Rebecca tried a few times to initiate contact, but I shut her down. She kept apologizing, but never gave me the sense that she truly wanted to fix things. It felt more like she was apologizing to soothe her own guilt, to ease her own conscience. I knew she was torn. I wasn't blind to her tears or her empty gaze. But a deeper part of me recognized that once a bond is broken that severely, no polite words could put it back together. I reached out to a lawyer. I began the quiet steps needed for a separation, maybe a divorce. My chest felt heavy, but also there was a clarity in it. I couldn't keep pretending. I decided to fight for custody of our son, to keep him as protected from the drama as possible. Meanwhile, I found out my mother-in-law was in damage control mode, trying to spin the story so that the watch theft was a misunderstanding, that maybe it was all a mistake, to save face. That was her talent, rewriting reality whenever it suited her, but she couldn't rewrite me anymore. I had the evidence. The truth was out. A few days after that, I came home to find Rebecca in the kitchen, tears on her cheeks, that same folded piece of paper in her hand, the one she'd written her initial confession on. She held it out to me. "I wrote this thinking it would spare you the details, that it would be kinder this way," she whispered. I was wrong. Her voice was choked with heartbreak, or maybe regret for being caught. "I betrayed you. But I never stopped caring, Michael. I stopped her by raising my hand. Don't," I said quietly. "You asked me not to make a scene. I honored your request. You asked me to keep silent. I kept silent. But now you want to talk when everything's in ruins. That's not how this works." She sobbed, and I felt a pang of sympathy. But it wasn't enough to erase the image of her with him, or the echo of her mother's accusations, or the countless nights I lay awake, feeling worthless. Then she said something that nearly crushed me. "I love our son, and I know you do too. We have to find some way to handle this." She was right, of course. But the word handle felt too neat, too tidy for the carnage of what she'd done. I just nodded. "I'm not out for revenge on you. You can keep your mother. You can keep your lover, or not. Whatever you decide. But I need to start over. That might mean cutting you out of my life for good." She stared at me like she couldn't believe those words. Then she nodded, tears streaming down her face. "If that's what you need," she murmured. I said nothing more, just turned away, leaving her there with her folded confession and her tears. If you ask me what that moment felt like, I'd say it was like watching a boat sink into dark waters. Once, I would have dived in to save it, but now I stood on the shore, letting it vanish beneath the waves. Over the following weeks, I took steps to move out. I found a small apartment not far from my son's school, so I could still pick him up, still be a father. Part of me burned with resentment, but part of me just wanted to be free. Some nights, I packed my things while Rebecca hovered, tears in her eyes, wanting to help but not daring to approach. We didn't argue. We barely spoke. Our silence was more brutal than any shouting match could have been. The final blow came on a Sunday evening. I'd just finished packing the last box in the bedroom, the place that used to be our sanctuary, with our king-size bed and warm memories. She was standing by the window, arms wrapped around herself, wearing a simple sweater. The sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in oranges and pinks. "Michael," she said, her voice almost lost in the hush. "Will you ever forgive me?" I looked at her for a long time. In that moment, I saw the woman I fell in love with years ago, the woman who once giggled at my corny jokes, who comforted me when my mother died, who promised to stand by me in sickness and in health. And I saw the stranger who had betrayed me with another man on our couch. My voice was thick as I answered, "I don't know." Then I picked up my box and walked out of that room. She didn't try to stop me. I loaded my car. Our son was staying at a friend's house, a sleepover. Maybe that was for the best. He wouldn't see me drive away with half my belongings. As I turned the ignition, my phone buzzed. Her name lit up the screen again. I stared at it, took a breath, and clicked the button to end the call without a word. This time, I didn't feel relief or triumph, just an aching finality. The engine purred, and I pulled out of the driveway for the last time as a resident of that house. A few months passed. The divorce process started. She didn't contest many terms. We agreed on joint custody, though I insisted on the largest share of time with our son. My mother-in-law seethed, but she couldn't deny the evidence that proved I wasn't a thief. In a twisted way, I had Josh to thank for that. He'd stolen a watch and given me the key to exonerate myself. I sometimes wonder if he and Rebecca stayed together. A part of me wanted to know, wanted to keep poking at the wound. But another part of me realized that was just salt in the cut. So I stopped asking. Nowadays, I live in a modest apartment. I have a couch, a table, a decent view of the city. I see my son frequently. He tells me about school and shows me his drawings. He doesn't mention the uncle anymore. Maybe that ended. Maybe it didn't. But it's none of my business now. At night, sometimes I sit on my balcony and watch the lights of the city flicker. And I remember how, once, I thought I had a stable life, a good marriage, a future full of ordinary happiness. Now I'm building a different future, one that requires I rediscover who I really am. Am I still the man who believes in love and loyalty, or am I just a shell, a cynic weighed down by betrayal? I don't know, but I'm breathing, day by day, and learning to live with my scars. Sometimes I reread this, my attempt at a letter or a confession, and I see how raw it all still is. But I also see a man who refused to disappear under shame. I see a father who fought for the truth, even when it cost him the last illusions he had. I can't say I've forgiven Rebecca or her mother, or Josh. Maybe I never will. But I've begun forgiving myself for the moments of weakness, for the times I stayed silent when I should have roared, for the times I let them treat me like I was nothing. I'm still healing. And maybe, in a strange way, that sentence that haunts me, "You always were second best," has become a catalyst for my own rebirth. Because now, I refuse to be second to anyone when it comes to my own dignity and my own worth. I let the final words fall onto the page, thick with the weight of everything I've been through. If I were to send this letter, I'd sign it simply as Michael, the man who learned the hard way what betrayal looks like, and who decided, in the end, that surviving it was the best revenge of all. Then I put down the pen, and I let the silence speak for me.